So, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to welcome you to a very sunny Plymouth, and I'm actually saying that in truth. It truly is a lovely sunny but very cold day in Plymouth on the fantastic southwest coast. We're delighted to have you all join us for this webinar this afternoon, considering the specific challenges for coastal communities. One of the priorities for Plymouth HDRC was related to increasing the knowledge and research associated with inequalities and specifically the coastal challenges. We're very lucky to work with such knowledgeable colleagues and wanted to be able to share some of the headlines with others. Today, we've got a great mix of people. We invited others from other HDRCs, coastal communities, public health and broader council colleagues. You're all so welcome. We hope this is a useful and informative session for you. As well as being able to share with you all some of the most up-to-date knowledge, it's a chance to check out the appetite for partnership working with you all, as we are keen to collaborate widely, and we've been really delighted with the opportunities we've had to collaborate so far, and we're great to continue those. Before I introduce our speakers, some housekeeping. We've put people on mute. I hope that's all right with you, but there are a lot of us, and we didn't want to upset the flow of the conversation. And at a suitable point in this afternoon, we will take a comfort break, but we'll wait and see when the conversation comes to a natural close. We'll be sending out the presentations in a couple of days to everybody who's signed up, so please don't worry, the slides will all be available to you. We're unsure how much time we're going to have for questions today. Our speakers have got so much they want to share. So what we've done is set up a question and answer chat line. If you can add your questions in there, we'll try if we can to cover some of them today. But if not, we commit to being able to send them out to you with the video transcription later in the week. So I hope that's all right, but we will answer all those questions, even if we can't quite get to it today. And likewise, if there's anybody who's interested in collaboration with us, please do leave your details and we'll be in touch. So without any further ado, thank you once again for joining us, and we're delighted to have three fantastic speakers with us today, all linked with the University of Plymouth. Firstly, Professor Sheena Asthana. Sheena leads the Centre for Health Technology and is co-director of the UK's first Centre for Coastal Communities. Her work looks at health inequalities, integrated care and digital innovation, and she's passionate about improving health in coastal areas. She's also the academic lead for Plymouth HDRC, and we're delighted to have her with us. Next, can I introduce Professor Sheela Agarwal. Sheela is Associate Head of Research and Innovation at Plymouth Business School, and she's also co-director for the Centre for Coastal Communities. She'll focus on the challenges facing coastal towns, areas such as regeneration, quality of life and economic resilience, and has a strong background in tourism and sustainability. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Alex Gibson. Alex is a health services senior researcher who specialises in data and resource allocation. He created the Coastal Communities Dashboard we'll be looking at today, which is sometimes known as CESA, and works on projects that help to shape policy and improve outcomes for coastal communities. So I'm sure you will agree we've got a great group of people here to talk with us, and we hope you find it a very enjoyable session. Thank you. So if I can pass over to Sheena.
Give an introduction. Yeah, we're going to try not to do death by PowerPoint, but got slightly excited because we've just finished a book, the three of us, and have got sort of some quite nice data. So Sheila's going to start off discussing why coastal communities matter and look at some indicators and some of the kind of challenges in terms of fair economic allocation. And then I will deal with the next two bullet points. Decided to focus on children and young people, partly because we simply couldn't focus on absolutely everything. But I think this is a really interesting group for local authorities because you are responsible for some of the wider determinants of health that really do impact upon children and young people. And also this is our public health, this relates to our public health challenges to the future. So that's the reason that we're focusing on this. We have updated the data on health, etc., and we can tell you about that if we have the time. And then Alex is going to introduce the CESA platform. And then we rather hoped we'd have a chance for a bit of an open discussion at the end. But like I sort of said, it depends on us whizzing through quite a lot of content. So apologies if it seems a bit fast. And if you want us to slow down, please just put something in the chat. So I think it's over to Sheena now, isn't it?
Okay. Hi everybody. So I want to spend a little bit of time very quickly looking at why do coastal communities matter. Seems quite an obvious question, but there are some very important reasons as to why they're so very important. Firstly, they are significant urban areas where people live and where people work. Estimates vary depending on definitions, but based on Office of National Statistics figures, around 10.4 million people live in coastal communities in England, with a further 2.2 million in Scotland and at least a further 1.2 million in Wales. If we take just England and Wales, in terms of where they might live, around 2.1 million people live in major coastal cities. Those are with a population of 200,000 or more. A further 2.2 million live in large cities, 2.8 in medium towns and cities, and 1.1 in smaller towns. And then the rest live in minor settlements or remote and sparsely populated communities. Secondly, coastal communities are important as there's been a profound shift in deprivation away from cities and towards coastal areas, as many are facing a range of interconnected social economic challenges that don't fit neatly into current north-south debates. Regional inequality in Britain continues to be understood to be polarised around a north-south divide and an inner-city problem, as opposed to an urban, non-urban divide. As a result, deprivation in coastal communities has never provoked significant levels of political engagement or academic discourse that inner city deprivation attracted in the 1980s, and Sheena will talk more about this later on in the presentation. Thirdly, coastal communities are important because whilst we know the range of socio-economic problems that many are experiencing, their interconnectedness is not well understood. Because of this, knowing exactly how to tackle their challenges remains somewhat of a conundrum, particularly what are the most effective and cost-effective points of entry for intervention. Is it housing? Is it health? Is it productivity? Is it employment? That's the question. Fourthly, coastal communities matter because despite recent recognition of their social economic problems in the Levelling Up White Paper and the CMO report on coastal health, their problems have become entrenched and persistent due to a long history of a lack of funding and policy focus. Lord Bassam highlighted the lack of policy focus, for example, in a House of Lords Select Committee on regenerating seaside towns and communities, published in a report published in 2019, and which described them as being at the end of the line, on the periphery, both geographically and economically, and a national embarrassment, stating that for too long our seaside towns have felt isolated, unsupported, and left behind. Fifthly, with evidence that coastal areas have generally borne the brunt of deprivation and may be the last to recover from the economic downturn caused by COVID, the need for a sustainable model of coastal regeneration has never been greater. This, of course, is easier said than done because there is a lack of agreement about what is driving patterns of inequality in coastal areas, what this means for economic, social and cultural trends in the periphery, and how policies might be deployed to create dynamic, thriving coastal communities and address social justice. Next slide, please. If we take a closer look at economic inequality on the coast, given the complex challenges that many are experiencing, increasingly the term left behind has been attached to coastal communities. The term left behind often refers synonymously to both disadvantaged specific cohorts of people and places, and it became central to UK economic and political discourse in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum in 2016. It broadly aligns with hotspots of political disengagement, neglect and discontent of those voted to leave and the Conservative Party's capture of the so-called Red Wall parliamentary seats, most notably in the Midlands and the north of England. Interestingly, the notion of left behind places is not a quintessential British phenomenon. though England is very unusual in the extent to which inequality is so coastal. Internationally, there are many examples of the use of different terms to describe disaffected and disadvantaged towns and cities, such as the Forgotten Territories in France and Italy. I'm not going to attempt my German here. So the suspended regions and legacy and shrinking cities in Germany, and the legacy cities, Rust Belt and Frost Belt in the US. The term crosscuts a range of spatial scales, ranging from specific groups of people to neighbourhoods, to communities, to villages, towns, cities, and regions. And while there is no single set of factors characterising left behind places, key identifiable features include economic and industrial decline and long-standing regional inequalities. Of course, there has been a legacy of economic change and restructuring taking place within our coastal communities, associated with the changing relationship with the beach, the foreshore, and the ocean. This has affected those communities based on shipbuilding and shipping, on fishing, and on tourism in particular. However, it is really important to acknowledge that there is diversity of experience, with some performing well whilst others are economically lagging. For those that are lagging, they have lost their traditional industries and as a result have become disconnected from what they once did and are exhibiting economic decline and political and cultural dislocation. Next slide, please. In terms of economic challenges, we know many are experiencing severe economic challenges and perform poorly against a range of economic metrics for coastal and non-coastal areas, including low productivity, higher than average unemployment rates, low incomes and financial hardship, seasonal jobs, low skills and educational attainment, job insecurity, and social immobility. If we take the unemployment claimant rate, so those claiming job seekers allowance or universal credit in coastal and non-coastal built-up areas, for example, between 2019 and 2024 by English region, as shown in the table on the slide, it reveals that the average rate of unemployment is significantly higher in coastal built-up areas at 5.5%, just along the bottom line of the table, than non-coastal at 4.7%. The North East, 7.1%, East Midlands, 6.9%, North West and Yorkshire and the Humber, 6.1%, are experiencing the highest average rates. Next slide, please. Infrastructural connectivity between places plays an important role in determining opportunities for economic development and the economic performance of coastal communities. Poor transport links, especially to inland cities and major economic hubs, make it difficult for coastal areas to attract investment and retain skilled workers. Mobility and transport are key for working-age adults with respect to access and employment, and for older people to remain healthy, active, and connected. When looking at job access, which is the next table here, unsurprisingly, access to jobs is far higher for people living in London than most other parts of the country, though people in non-coastal LSOAs in the northwest, which includes the Manchester metropolitan area, have access to nearly as many jobs. What is notable, however, is that across all regions, access to jobs is consistently and substantially poorer for people living in coastal than non-coastal areas, ranging from there being just 18% as many jobs within reach of coastal LSOAs compared to non-coastal LSOAs in the East Midlands, to 87% as many jobs in coastal areas in the northeast. This reflects a structural disadvantage for coastal communities tied to both geography, so peripherality, limited transport links, and economic history, loss of industry, fewer employment hubs. The lowest access to jobs among coastal LSOAs is in the East Midlands, South West, and the Yorkshire and Humber regions. Here counts of 107,000, 190,000 and 200,000 respectively are dwarfed by the 1 million plus jobs available from LSOAs in the non-coastal Northwest region and London. Next slide, please. Another example of an economic metric where coastal areas perform poorly is average gross pay. The next table shows average gross pay for all employee jobs in 2021 across all coastal and non-coastal local authorities, and it shows that there is a coastal earnings deficit. Next slide, please. If we think about economic investment and geographical inequality, coastal communities in England are also disadvantaged in this respect. Britain in the 21st century is a deeply divided nation and is one of the most regionally unequal countries in the developed world in terms of GDP per capita, productivity and disposable income. The gap between South East England and the rest of the UK is now wider than that between East and West Germany or Northern and Southern Italy. Economic investment is not helped by the UK's unusually centralised governance with rules that work against the periphery. This combined with short-term electoral cycles and a lack of policy continuity and a persistent bias of spending on innovation and infrastructure, in particular in London and the South East, has served to disadvantage coastal communities. With the onset of decentralisation, this may help, but the extent to which it will coastal cities more than rural hinterlands is questionable. Next slide, please. One example of how central government funding potentially disadvantages coastal areas is the operationalisation of the UK's Treasury's Green Book. It sets out approved techniques for key appraisal and evaluation issues such as long-term discounting and applies to all public spending proposals. However, there are concerns about bias against peripheral areas, since one of the metrics used to demonstrate value for money is the benefit cost ratio, which in part is generated by the land value uplift that occurs because of any investment. These are suppressed in coastal areas due to them being landlocked, and so only land with a 180-degree arc can increase in value. Environmental factors such as protected landscapes and geospatial factors such as low population and/or business densities not only limit the amount of land that can be developed, but also compromise the social return on any investment. Over to you, Sheena.
Thank you. So I just want to pick up on the suggestion that Sheela made that our mental maps of deprivation are still very suggestive of a north-south divide, as well as being an inner-city problem. So if you have a look at the index of multiple deprivation, and I'm really talking at the moment about the 2019 IMD, we haven't had the chance to look at the 25 yet, you still, although coastal deprivation is picked up, we still see deprivation as being a really strong inner city issue, including London. And when we've started to look at some of the plausible indicators of deprivation, it's really puzzling that, that cities that are actually doing pretty well economically, but also in terms of health and education outcomes, etc., are still coming across as really quite deprived. So we did have a look at, as part of the book, at the IMD 2019. And what was really interesting was, first of all, fairly poor correlations, not surprisingly with the overall index, because the index isn't designed to correlate, the overall summary index isn't designed to correlate with specific domains. But in even some cases, the subdomains of the IMD were really explaining a very small percentage of variation in key, for example, health outcomes. The other thing which was really interesting is that when we sort of looked at where the IMD said a level of need might be, it was usually underestimating the actual plausible indicator of need in a coastal area and significantly overestimating that in London. So the IMD seemed to be working differently in different geographical areas. And what we would quite like to do is just test that assumption out with the new IMD. But if you can just move to the next slide. this is for me quite interesting. So these are the education domains, the overall IMD, and then various education domains. So there's I think that's education and skills, and then children, young people, and the adult skills domain. Now, for the most part, actually, the correlations aren't too bad for these subdomains, apart from for actually looking at actual educational attainment, where it's a terrible, predictor of educational attainment. And that just bothers me, because if we're going to try to level up education, if we're going to start to look at, as the formula at the moment tries to do, it's clearly not really working. And I do not understand what is going on here, why an education domain is not demonstrating educational inequality and poor educational performance. So I think there's a problem here. And as I said, if we actually look at the actual indicators, they tend to way overestimate educational need in London and underestimate it in coastal areas. So if we can move on to the next slide, this is even more puzzling. So this is the relationship between the crime domain and recorded crime rates. And I mean, quite frankly, what was going on, we haven't got a clue, but it's not particularly explaining anything, really. I mean, these are terrible correlation coefficients, and we simply do not know what's going on. One thing we have found when we've mapped out crime is a significant, again, that there is a coastal excess. So again, something interesting. The IMD as a whole should not be used as a sort of indicator for specific issues. And we're always puzzled about why we're not using more direct indicators anyway when we have them. But there is a tendency for councils and for politicians to use the overall IMD as a sort of overall summary indicator of need and do sort of special pleading around it. And we've got some concerns that certainly the previous IMD might have been slightly stacked against coastal areas. So if you can go on to the next slide, please, Kirsty. So we do need to update this analysis. We need to see what's happening with the IMD 2025 and see if it's more sensitive to coastal deprivation. There's been a little bit of work done by West Sussex, which does suggest that coastal communities are more likely to be deprived than England as a whole, but we need to dig deeper into that. There are particular concerns about the high weightings that are given to benefit data. Again, this is sort of sensitive stuff, but you'll be aware of the fact that there is a national debate now about what benefit data, particularly sickness data, which has really been increasing very fast, what that actually tells us about deprivation. The other thing that's going to change with the new IMD is the inclusion of after housing costs, which is expected to benefit London. So again, London might appear to be sort of more deprived than other indicators would suggest. Right, I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at children and young people. As I mentioned earlier, I think this is quite a nice thing for local authorities, because you do have a number of services that are targeted, not least children's social services, but also housing has a huge impact as a determinant of health. I think it's really interesting to look at. So what we did here is we updated a kind of a graph. I'm afraid it's not in pretty colour because the books insisted on black and white figures, but we updated something that we did for the Chris Whitty report in 2021, this time using MSOA level, not LSOA level data. And what you can see here is coastal outcomes relative to non-coastal outcomes, and it's depressing. So if we look at level 3 qualifications, significantly lower, progress to higher education, significantly lower, and yet things like admission to hospital for drug misuse, self-harm and alcohol attributable admissions significantly higher. So something is happening to our children and young people on the coast. And I think my alarm bells are really ringing here, because it's worrying, because we should be worried about this age group, but I think it's also a portent for public health inequalities in the future as they grow older. So let's try to look at some of the wider determinants of health and work out what might be going on. Well, one thing may be the role of educational capital. Now, if you look at coastal versus non-coastal, taking London out, there isn't a huge difference nationally in terms of, for example, people without with no qualifications. I'll come to this in a minute. There's huge variations regionally, but this is probably really quite important, because if you have had a good experience of school, if you've been successful in education and you've gone on perhaps to university, you're much more likely to have confidence and expectations about, first of all, what you expect from your school environment for your kids, but also how you can support your home learning environment. So, that there is something that is likely to affect whether or not you think that the education is something that your family is good at, whether you really want to support your children's educational trajectories and you have the capabilities to do that. So could I have the next slide, please? As I said, overall, there isn't a strong difference. This is in 2021, but if you start to look at regional differences, they're really, really pronounced. So in London, a very, very small percentage of adults have no qualifications compared to a significant percentage, particularly in coastal areas in the East Midlands, the East of England, and indeed the Southwest. And what you can see is that there are significantly higher percentages of populations within those regions in coastal areas that lack qualifications compared to non-coastal built-up areas. And then if we start to look at small built-up areas, appallingly high numbers of people with no qualifications. We're used to sort of looking at Jaywick as a highly deprived small area, but equally Maplethorpe, which is near Skegness, very, very high levels of adults with no qualifications. So this is going to shape educational capital and may well be one of the determining factors about poor educational outcomes on the coast. Can I have the next one, please? There's also, I think, something quite important about the psychosocial environment. And I'm kind of really interested in this because it's hard to quantify. I used to, when I worked in London a lot more, I used to sit on, I think it was the 137 from Clapham to Westminster, and all these kids would get on from quite deprived housing estates. And as we were going along the bus, you could sort of see all that opportunity around you. You could see what jobs could get you, whether they were jobs in the economic sector, social, political sector. You landed up in Westminster. There was just something about that whole world of work around you that you could see and you could aspire to. That's very, very different in coastal areas where often children just cannot see. I mean, the whole world of work is quite an abstract concept because opportunities out there are in low-paid hospitality and care sectors. I mean, any of you who've had to try to get work experience for your children when they're at secondary school, well, it's just an absolute flipping nightmare if you're living in a rural or coastal area. So I think that one of the problems here is that you've got low levels of aspiration and self-esteem. You've also kind of got kids who feel left behind when those with higher levels of education go off to university. They're literally feeling left behind. They can develop nothing to lose attitudes, which may again influence harmful behaviours in adolescence. Suicide data are really hard to come by because they're obviously very, very sensitive. But those of us, certainly in Devon, there is a definite issue with regard to suicide. So I think that this is important to look at. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, these types of factors are likely to lead to educational outcomes. What we've got here is a map of average key stage 4. So that's at 16, isn't it? Attainment 8 score, yeah. And what you can see is just look around the coast and you can see a complete peripheral effect going on here. London, of course, has educational outcomes which are absolutely off the scale. And indeed, in some cases, we can see that the most deprived children in London are doing better than children who are not on free school meals on the periphery. I mean, for me, this is a really important determinant of future health inequalities for a number of reasons. Education is going to predict employment, your income, your access to material resources. It's also going to very strongly related to psychosocial well-being, to resistance, etc., to health behaviours. So many people would agree that this is probably the most modifiable social determinant of health inequality. And these types of inequalities that we're seeing really do need to be addressed. Can I have the next slide, please? Another issue, I think, on the coast, and it's really difficult. We don't measure ACEs. It's very, very difficult to get data on this, but we can start to look at factors that are likely to be associated with adverse childhood experiences. And these include, we're very well aware that amongst those adverse experiences, exposure to parental substance use is a very big problem, as is exposure to mental health problems and domestic abuse. We know that this affects children as they're literally developing. It affects their neurological, their physiological systems. It relates to delayed child development. Also, that chronic stress tends to kind of give rise to inflammation. We're sort of literally embodying health disadvantage in that growing child. So just again, next slide, some evidence of health risk behaviours that are becoming normalised. The particularly worrying one, of course, is drug use in coastal areas. I showed you the slide earlier on where we can see that children themselves, children and young people on the coast, are significantly more likely to be admitted for substance use, as are their parents. It was hard to get, I don't think we got MSOA level data here, so we looked at upper tier local authorities. And what you can see is that the ones with the highest age standardised mortality rates for death are coastal, as are the ones, and if we actually look, over half of the predominantly coastal LAs were amongst the worst 20%. So there's a real skew going on here. Something strange is happening on the coast, and this is a really important issue, I think, for children as they're growing up in environments which are, this is a really, really important indicator of an adverse childhood experience. Can I have the next one, please? Something that Plymouth has identified as well, which is really interesting and quite controversial, is possible evidence of intentional dosing as opposed to accidental ingestion in young children. So this is our colleague Gary Wallace, who was looking at serious case reviews, found that the average age was about 19 months, which is quite hard to kind of unscrew mum's methadone bottle at that point. But he also found some German research which was taking hair samples and which were indicating that these weren't one-off ingestions, that they were happening successively. And this is again really, really interesting because it could trigger epigenetic alterations that predispose kids to drug use themselves. It's not a great thing to do. There's quite a lot of controversy about whether or not this is an area that should be researched. And one thing we're trying to do is actually just do a stakeholder consultation across councils to examine knowledge of this issue and to really reflect some of the stakeholder conversations we've been having. So on the one hand, you've got public health people saying, look, this is a real big issue, but then you've got concerns perhaps amongst social services saying we don't want to stigmatise parents, and we frankly don't have the capacity to do anything about this issue. So it's quite an interesting one. So I think if we do manage to release this survey, do be aware of it. Those of you who are in councils, we're really interested to know about your views about this. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, another issue, of course, is transient populations, and this doesn't affect all coastal communities, but because you have declines in tourism, and therefore, previous bed and breakfasts, etc., that are now not being used for that purpose, there has been a growth of houses of multiple occupation, which are often poor quality housing. But similarly, hotel housing and HMOs have been used to rehouse people from social services displacements, often people who've been released from prison, etc., people who've had to move from their initial area. So that's also, it's bringing highly vulnerable people into coastal communities, but it's also really hard for those families themselves. If you're displaced from your home area, you're displaced from your school, you're displaced from your networks, including your family networks, and displacement is a risk factor for chronic psychological stress. And we know that psychological stress is related to a whole series of physiological changes that predispose you to inflammation and to risk for chronic disease. So it's again another issue. Housing is a fascinating one because we tend to look at affordability alone. Now, if you look at London is the least affordable place, clearly, and the inclusion, as I said, of after housing costs will change the pattern or will influence the pattern of deprivation, again to suggest that London has high levels of IMD. Looking at affordability, people in non-coastal BUAs are more likely to live in affordable areas of housing, either to buy or rent, compared to coastal residents. So there is a coastal dimension here. But what's really interesting, I think, for us is the fact that we also need to look beyond affordability to accessibility. So one of the things that's really, really interesting in terms of a coastal and a non-coastal divide is presence of social housing. So with the exception of the North East and Yorkshire and Humber, coastal built up areas have significantly lower rates of social housing than non-coastal BUAs. And the biggest distinction will be between London and coastal areas. So there are parts of London where about 40% of the housing stock is social housing. Now that's going to affect housing availability as opposed to affordability. So I think that we've got to work out a way of creating indices that create these that encompass both of these different issues, because it starts to become quite important. If you have low rates of social housing and housing is not affordable, it becomes much, much more difficult to get rentable property. This is particularly the case in holiday areas where we see high rates of Airbnb, and Alex has mapped Airbnb. He'll talk about the CESA portal presently. But what we're seeing is higher rates of housing precariousness. Now, this leads to stress related to housing, which, as I've mentioned, is a big risk factor for both mental health problems, but also for that long-term impact and stress, chronic stress on inflammation and risk for chronic disease. So this is a really interesting issue, and we're trying to sort of delve deeper into housing as a social determinant of health, because it's not one that's really looked at very much. It's difficult because we don't have individual level data. So if you're doing things ecologically, it starts to become a bit tricky, but I still think it's a really interesting issue. Just to give you an example, can I have the next slide? Torbay is fascinating. This has one of the lowest proportions of social housing of any English local authority. So against a national average of 18%, Torbay has 8%. I think Cornwall's about 12%. Plymouth's a bit higher, it's about 16%. And as a result, what you have in Torbay is a very long list for council and housing associate social housing homes, and huge shortfalls in provision. What this appears to be associated with is a significantly higher rate of family homelessness, so much higher than the average national average. And it has been argued is one of the factors driving significantly higher rates of children requiring protection and care. So fascinating looking at housing, and I think it's something we'd certainly want to do a little bit more work on. Can I have the next one? This is another angle on housing, and I'm only showing this because I thought I was so impressed by this map, which Alex did. So effectively, it's not just affecting families and one's housing precariousness and one's health risks. Housing also has an impact on the local job market. So this is a fascinating map. This is basically what Alex did is looked at the number of rental properties that were available to a grade 1 qualified teacher. And this was using an ONS benchmark that you shouldn't be paying more than 30% of your annual salary on rent. And as you can see, there are just huge patches of actually rural and coastal England where it's really hard for public sector workers, key public sector workers, to basically afford housing in these areas. And I think this really is important because it's going to affect the kind of quality of resources that we can make available to start addressing things like education inequalities. It's just another factor behind the inequality that we're looking at. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, this is really interesting, and I think as local authorities, you'd be interested in this. So what we did here, you'll be aware that social services data is only available at a local authority level, which is very large, and it doesn't help us to start to look at coastal and non-coastal areas. Now, as part of an ESRC funded project, we are trying to develop a new coastal classification. But what we did here for local authorities and ICBs is we basically came up with a sort of our own classification of how coastal a local authority was. And we looked at the percentage of people living in coastal LSOAs in a local authority. So if more than 75% of residents were in a coastal LSOA, we called that a coastal local authority. If it was between 25 and 75, we called it a mixed authority. And if it was less than 25, we called it a non-coastal authority. So that's the definition we used. And what you can see is that coastal local authorities are having to spend more, significantly more, than non-coastal local authorities on children's social services. Now, it's not likely that's because they have more money to spend. It's very difficult now to look at allocations for children's social care because since 2020, they've merged adult and children's services into a sort of an overall social care pot. What we do know is that the kind of the relative needs formula for social services has not changed, though there are signs now, and actually it was Alex who was the methodological lead on this new formula. They're now proposing a new formula, but this won't have changed. And what we do know is that in the past, allocations have always been much higher for non-coastal areas. So this is not driven by the fact that authorities have more to spend. It will be driven by the fact that due to legal requirements to safeguard children, they're having to spend this money. Go to the next slide, please. This is really interesting because this is again looking at the increase in expenditure on children's services from 2015, 2016. And again, what you can see is a significant increase in coastal local authorities, in local authorities that have a significantly higher proportion of their residents living in coastal LSOAs, 17.6% against 11.9% in non-coastal areas. So something is happening to drive demand for children's services on the coast. And as I said, I don't think this is a reflection of having more money to spend. I think it's a reflection of having to spend that money. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is also quite interesting. This is looking at variations in caseload for family social workers in, again, coastal and mixed areas. The gap has narrowed. So if we go back to 2020, the caseloads were highest in coastal areas and lowest in inner London. They're still lowest in inner London and they're still highest in coastal areas, but the gap has narrowed. So in other words, something seems to be happening to reduce caseloads in coastal areas, but we're still looking at an inequality here. And again, unsurprisingly to me, inner and outer London tend to always have the most favourable indicators when we're starting to look at these things. Can I have the next one? Okay, so this is just a key list of indicators, the health of children and young people in English, coastal, non-coastal and London MSOAs. This hides quite a lot of regional variation, and I don't go on to the next slide yet, but the next slide will sort of give you a little bit of indication of this. But what you can see is, with the exception of prevalence of obesity statistics, for the most part, London is doing very, very well indeed. Emergency admissions for injuries at all ages, 5 under 15 and 15 to 24, are higher in coastal areas, significantly higher than in London. Births to mothers aged 12 to 17 are higher. And look at the difference between coastal areas and London. And similarly, rates of smoking amongst young people are higher in coastal areas than in other areas. So we're already seeing indications that the health of our children and young people are worse in coastal areas. Again, this should really worry us. This is a significant health inequality, and yet it's not one that kind of tends to be talked about very much. I think I've got my final slide now. We have whizzed through this very, very fast. So I sort of mentioned that within particular regions, there are, it really starts to sort of really show. When we're looking at coastal MSOAs in the East Midlands, one should point out that a relatively small percentage of MSOAs and LSOAs in the East Midlands are actually coastal, but they have huge inequalities. So if we have a look at, for example, obesity, amongst the highest rates of obesity, age 10 to 11. Teenage pregnancies, the rate of teenage pregnancies in this area is nearly 20 times that of London. And then looking at admission rates for hospital admission rates for injuries against the northeast, just huge differences, again, between both London figures, but the highest in the country. So again, something weird is going on the coast, and I think we absolutely have to sort of start digging down into that. So that brings me, I think, that's the next slide. Is the next slide then introducing Alex? Yes, that brings me to an end of mine and Sheila's bit. Elaine, I don't know if you want to have a break or if you want to open up for immediate questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's a huge amount of information. It feels quite overwhelming, actually, in terms of how do you get into those issues? Where does the circle start and end? There aren't any questions I can see in the questions and answers at the moment, but I wonder if people have got questions they'd like to ask.
I think Julian just put his hand up. I don't know how to unmute people.
Yeah. Kirsty, can we unmute people for the minute? Is that all right? Okay, so
There's
there's
Yeah, I've
Natalie
just
and
lost
Julie.
Julian for now. Give me 2 secs.
so there's Natalie is asking a question. Natalie Edelman, can we invite Natalie?
She's still muted, I think. Kirsty, do you know how to? Oh, well done.
Hello there.
Thank you.
Thank
Hi,
you
Natalie.
so much. Hello, thank you so much for that talk. It's so interesting. I'm a public health registrar, but I'm an academic by background, and I've long been interested in how we need to really overhaul all our socioeconomic and socio-demographic categories, including for things like employment and housing. So it was really interesting to hear. My background's particularly sexual and reproductive health, so I was fascinated to see that huge difference in teenage pregnancies. And I wondered whether you'd been able to do any work mapping any of these risk factors that you're seeing against service provision. So in particular, I'm thinking about things like reduced pharmacy provision, then reducing access to morning after pill as it used to be known, and whether you've been able to do any of that work. So I'm quite interested in how you could spatially map where there's a lack of assets like pharmacies that then impact negatively on some of these health outcomes.
I think the answer is we haven't done that work, but Alex, I'm passing that question to you.
Thank you very much. One of the immediate difficulties that comes to my mind has been the radical transformation of the number of pharmacies that are around. So here in the Southwest, we've lost a huge number and a huge proportion of pharmacies. So from a purely practical point of view, almost certainly the data won't be up to date in that sense. Also, the pregnancy data, MSOA level, these are large areas, and it's we haven't done it is the immediate answer. How possible it would be to do, well, that's an interesting question. To a certain extent, when I come onto the CESA portal, I think you'll see so a lot of what's been talked about so far has been very sort of large scale, coastal versus non-coastal, and London. Actually, we have a lot of very local data, and one of the things we're trying to do is make what data there is available, small area data available to people with a particular interest in things. So hopefully, although off the top of my head I can't think of data that we've got there beyond what you've seen, the CESA portal and access to this data will allow people to explore exactly those questions, and we will be looking at the location of pharmacies and distance to pharmacy. There is data on that, the distance of pharmacies from LSOA so there's possibilities, but we haven't done it yet, and we certainly haven't done an academic analysis of it. So it's very interesting.
Very interesting. If I put my email in the chat, would you be able to sort of email me some details on how, like, if there's access to some of that data? Because I'm really interested in this whole area of like taking and sort of area level look at assets in relation to risks. Yeah. Thank you.
So someone called Carol has put a thing in you could map the latest pharmaceutical needs assessment data that every health and wellbeing board has had to publish by the 1st of October.
Right. Okay. So is that in the chat? Because that's part of as I will be talking about when I talk about the CESA portal. Part of what I'm wanted to do is an interaction. So if there's data you know about that we haven't yet captured, and if there are ways in which you would like that data to become available and mapped and interrogatable, if that's the right word, then please put it on the chat. But I'll come back to more of that when we talk about the CESA portal in a minute, or after a break, however we're going to play this.
Yeah. That's great. Is there any other questions from anybody? Can I ask one? Am I allowed to take chairman's action? Is that okay? A prerogative. So this is probably a really horrible question, but actually I'm just looking at something like the figures that you showed around it costs more per child for social care interactions in coastal areas, and I'm just sitting here thinking, why? How could you succinctly come to a conclusion as to what is actually causing that, or is it such a complex answer?
It's not costing more. It's not costing more per child. It's just the per child of a certain age, you've got more children effectively. Is that not right, Alex? You've got effectively you've got more children requiring social care. So per child under 18 or whatever, I can't remember what the denominator was, there is higher spend per capita or per capita.
Right, I misread that then. I thought
so it's not that you're spending more per child, it's just you're having to spend on more children, on a higher percentage of children. then you would be. It's quite possible that people are spending less per child, but you know, again, we just don't. I mean, we can actually start. Can we start looking at actual spend per child? We should be able to do, shouldn't we? Haven't done that. I mean, per child receiving care, but what's happening is there are more children requiring care.
Right. Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood that. So got confused by the figures. So are there any other questions that people would like to ask? Anything particular? That was really helpful. Can I suggest that's been almost an hour? Shall I suggest that we have a sort of an 8-minute comfort break and get back at 5 past the hour, 3:05? Would that be all right? So people can get a cup of coffee or a quick wander around, and then we can concentrate carefully on Alex's presentation about the CESA portal. Is that okay with everybody?
Sounds good.
Very much everybody for coming back so promptly. That's great. So I've already introduced Alex, who's going to introduce us to the CESA portal. So over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elaine. And that means I have to share my screen, and this is where things could all go horribly wrong.
You want us to sing?
Yeah, possibly. Right, with a bit of luck, you should see the CESA portal website, which is on the Shiny Apps sort of server. And so as long as that carries on working, we should be okay. So this is in the context. Sheena and Sheela have been talking about the sort of large-scale generalities about coastal versus non-coastal. And in large measure, of course, it's underpinned by a huge amount of very local area data. So most of the, and here are the upper tier local authorities you can see here, most of these actually have coastal areas as well as very inland areas. And to get some sort of idea about what is coastal or the characteristics of coastal areas, what the challenges of coastal areas might be, you have to use local area data. So as part of a large ESRC funded project into understanding the research and policy needs of English coastal communities, which is orientated towards creating a classification of these coastal areas, we have collected and are collecting a huge amount of small area data. Now we're doing the classification not just as sort of counting angels on the head of a pin type exercise, but it really is quite important to know how these coastal areas differ one from another. They're just not all the same. So for all the data that Sheena and Sheela were showing you, we really do need to get to grips with what's going on in different parts of the country and in different sorts of coastal areas, some of which, to use Sheila's terminology, are leading, are economically flourishing, and some of which are lagging and are socially and demographically and economically challenged. And so we need to get down to that sort of stuff. So to do that, we collected lots of data, but traditionally what happens in academic exercises, you collect all the data and it just sort of disappears. We've put a lot of effort into all that, and we wanted to make sure that that data was available to others to work on as they like, to help facilitate that research, as indeed was suggested. One of the things that has been most exciting about the work we've been doing, all the sorts of questions, like for instance, sexual health and availability of pharmacies, these are passing through our heads all the time, but we can't do we can't do all of this by any means, but other people have those interests, so let's make the data available as possible for other people to access. So the CESA data portal, Coastal England Small Area Data Portal, is all about that. Now, it's at that website, and you've had the address sent to you. It is very much a work in progress. We have only scratched the surface in terms of putting the data that we have onto the portal. It was written, and I'm not sure if I'm happy with the decision I made a while back, it's written using R Shiny, which is a way of displaying data as you'll see in a minute. There's lots of other ways of doing it. Tableau, you'll have come across, Microsoft Power BI, but I went with this because it was so powerful, and you decide what you want to do and you can kind of get there. You can do anything you want, whereas a lot of these more commercial products, you kind of have to do what they allow you to do. But it's a complete nightmare. It's complicated to do, and it's been taking so much time. So where we are now is we've got this beta version up. There are all sorts of things I want to change about it, but there's all sorts of things in the discovery tools, for instance, that we want to introduce. And this is where we'd really love your feedback. If you have any ideas, this is your chance to dream about how you would like to be able to access this data, and send us the link. And the links will be at the end of the presentation in the last slide. So please let us know what you think about how this could develop as an interface to the data that we have. Anyway, enough of that. So what we have on the site itself, lots of kind of information about its context, what we're hoping to do, and all the rest of it, and instructions as to use it. But before I go into any detail, just through the tabs, first of it, it's in the context of a coastal but actually, before I do that, well, I've done the whole country. It's much quicker if you look at parts of the country rather than the whole country. So actually, just to make things a bit faster, let's just choose the southwest. So we're defining the scope in which we're interested. So what is coastal? Part of the project is about defining what are the coastal areas that we're wanting to classify, and there's endless ways in which you can define coastal areas. You can find it. Well, in fact, if I just click that, you'll see the various definitions that we are playing with. We will actually go further away from the coast. We're kind of now talking about a 10-kilometre sort of distance from the coast definition, but this is a bit angels on the head of a pin type stuff. One of the problems is there's all sorts of different types of data that are available, and as I set this up originally, I was making, allowing all sorts of options. Now I'm thinking more that let's make everything available through a 2021 geography, the LSOA geography, or the output area geography for 2021, and attribute the data we have for other geographies, because it just gets so complicated. So part of it is what is coastal. Part of it is what classifications we might want to be applying. I'll look at this in more data. Another part of it is getting access to the data, particular data sets, all sorts of data sets that we've got in there, although, as I say, it's just scratching the surface. Another tab is about looking for all of the data about particular places, and then there's discovery tabs about things you might want to do with the data, and then a couple of quick tabs at the end about, well, one, a barely started list of all the other interactive portals to data that are now being created, and this is hardly touching. This will be developed and made more comprehensive in due course, and then acknowledgements, and then finally, should you really want it, a whole series of help videos describing how to use it. That's not what we're into at the moment. So easiest if you start off. This is relatively quick, but the smaller the area you look at, the quicker it works. So let's just make it nice and quick by having a look at Devon, Plymouth and Tor Bay. So this is the area in which we're wanting to look at the data that's available for the small area data that we use before. As I say, the context, and I'm going to get rid of this in due course, is we have to start off by defining what is the coastal area. What are we going to define as the coastal fringe? And what you define depends, how you define that depends on the data you get access to. As I say, this is something I want to change because I want to be able to not be constrained in that sense. Once you're in any of these maps, you can move around them, you can have a look at the areas and get download data about those areas in due course. The classification, that's the end part of our project. So again, as I've tried to produce a sort of description of what you can and can't do in the things, but you can read that if you ever want to go there. And the only classification I've put at the moment is there's a series of placeholders. The project has still got some best part of a year to run. In due course, we will have these classifications, but for the time being, let's just map that classification, which is just an IMD placeholder type classification. But it's quite useful to illustrate a couple of things. One, when you're looking at the data, you can go into the areas, let's have a look down at Exmouth, for instance, go into the particular areas you're interested in, click on it, and you get some the information. This will happen on all of the maps. Sometimes it's the data that you're looking at. In this case, it's just the classification you're looking at. You can pan it across to look at other areas. All on the coast here, or you can, if you really want to have a look at it, you can look at it full screen and go back to. So hopefully that went to a full screen image for you. And this, as I say, at this stage is just because it's the classification itself, and it's a pretend classification. This is just showing the coastal fringe as we defined it on that first slide. Just go back again. Where it actually becomes more useful to everybody is when you start looking at the data. So at the moment, we've got quite a lot of categories. I think there's about 200 or 300 variables in here. I've got about 1,000 variables that we've now collected at the LSOA and output area scale. So not only am I going to have to rethink how I categorize and subcategorize and come to the variables here, but I'm going to have to think about having a search tool in here and the rest of it. But so, okay, we've got accessibility here. What's accessibility? Proximity to hazards, drive time. That looks interesting for anybody. How far to the nearest pub? And you can plot the. Oh, there we have it. That's lovely, don't we? Like that. Reload. Sorry about that. For whatever reason, the shiny portal has just switched off. So let's bounce that back up again. It takes probably 30 seconds or so to boot up. General whip time. I'll have a quick slurp of coffee.
Alex, is it worthwhile mentioning that the data are actually available nationally, also for non-coastal areas? These are national data sets.
I'm just about to get to that. Okay, so that has booted back up again. Let's take the. Have we boarded the south? I'll prove that we have. Let's look in the northeast, and let's just. Actually, no, that's too large an area. It will slow it down, but never mind. What is coastal? I'll take the same definition, the 5 kilometres, and I'll use the LSOA in the 21, define the fringe, go to the classification, go to the explore the data. Well, we can look at deprivation. No, I'll look at the accessibility and proximity to assets, and I hope this isn't because there's an actual problem with that bit of data, and plot the data set. So here, what we have is the map of the south, the northeast, I beg your pardon, and it is the data. Well, we'll see where that data came from. I want to just talk about what information you get from this site. You get the metadata. So this is the drive time to the nearest food outlet. Oh, food outlet. I thought I was looking at alcohol. Never mind. And it's come from the CDRC, access to healthy assets and hazard index. So all of the bits of data that you might click on, drive time to the nearest pub. If you do that, once you get to it, you can call up the metadata, which will tell you how it's come and give you links and all the rest of it. So let's have a look at the deprivation index of. We have got all the 25 deprivation data, but it's not on this thing yet. So plot it. In this case, what's quite interesting about the IMD, it was using the 2011 LSOA geographies, but to put it onto 2021 geographies, and these are the sorts of things we're struggling with all the time. We have to attribute it, so we kind of talk about how we do it, and there's access to data about how the algorithm works and all the rest of it. So the gist of it is we're trying to make this data readily findable, readily available, and readily mappable. All areas is what Sheena was saying there. So instead of just having a look at the data for the coastal fringe, and the little red thing here tells me it's working. And now we have it for and that's a bit difficult to see because of the shape of the thing. So let's just make it full screen. And now we have that map for the whole of the northeast area. And as again, as I said, as you click on particular areas, you get that particular bit of information about that particular LSOA in these cases. Now you can look at all sorts of, look at it in different ways. So that's zoomed in there. Let's get back a little bit. You can look at it rather than this continuous scale, you can look at it in an equal count scale, which often gives a different maps of slippery creatures. You get very different sorts of pictures depending on how you portray things, but it can help you focus on things. You get these plots on the side here. So in this particular area defined by the scope, the coastal areas are on average more deprived and have a much higher tail there, and you can look at that either as a violin plot or as a jitter plot, which gives some indication of the scatter of points as the individual LSOAs, as well as the distribution of them. So quite a lot, and this is the non-coastal areas, quite a lot of low deprivation LSOAs, and in the coastal much more evenly distributed. Now that just depends on the particular areas, I say, as you've defined as a scope. The map should tell you what you're getting at, what you're looking at. The legend should show you this is, as I say, the equal count scale. So how many are the different colors? All of them should have a little, every map should have a little bit thing here. A darker implies generally greater policy challenge. So the IMD score is getting darker as it gets higher. And as I say, you get the metadata there.
Can you show some of the health outcome data? So the attributed.
Sure, I can.
Maybe go to East Midlands, because we did point out the East Midlands looks like it's very.
Yeah, well, East Midlands is interesting. Okay, you want me to go all the way back to here?
I do. It's quite useful for people to see how you're doing it, because you're going quite quick. And
yeah, I know. The East Midlands is an interesting one because East Midlands, in terms of what's in the coastal area.
You're in the east of England, not East Midlands.
I beg your pardon. East Midlands. Define the scope of the East Midlands. In fact, most of East Midlands is not coastal. The coastal part of East Midlands is very small. So let's go to the, let's define the scope. Let's go to the what is coastal. We'll come back to there in a second. Let's define the fringe in terms of the 5 kilometre. I mean, I hope I'm illustrating that you can actually explore your way around this fairly quickly, and it is fairly responsive as long as you don't want to look at the country as a whole. And then look at the data, and you're wanting to look at, let's have a look at, see what we've got. I hate it when I'm going down health morbidity. What have we got? Well, let's have a look at stroke prevalence. This is from the, should we look at stroke prevalence or hypertension? That's usually more, because it's more prevalent, you don't get so much random variation. Plot that for the East Midlands. In a second it will come up. So round here, which is the, well, there you go, Maplethorpe that you were talking about here, with very high levels of stroke. Let's look at the place as a whole, the East Midlands as a whole, see if we get a nice sort of coastal, non-coastal picture. Let's go look at the continuous scale. Like this in a second. And you're getting, I mean, it's I mean, the coastal fringe comes out quite strongly there, but there are bound to be other areas where you get quite high. But interestingly, I mean, you're looking in the Derby area, you know, quite light greens and yellows. Now, I have to say, I mean, this is a good point to make here. This is data, not necessarily information, insofar as this is based on QOF data. And the QOF is GP, well, there's two things going on here, as will be described in the metadata. It's coming from GPs, and GPs vary in, well, can vary, I can't prove, but they can vary in the degree to which they are diligent in collecting all this information. So you're never quite sure whether the variations are GP related, but it also has been attributed. So it's based on data collected by GP practices, likely to be generally reliable, not equally effective in identifying and recording. And then also they're attributed, where does it say? They're attributed to 2021 LSOAs, because it's actually GP level data that we've had to attribute to the LSOAs surrounding them. So it's information, but you have to interpret it, and we've tried to do two things: give all the information you need in the metadata to help you understand what you're getting, but then, as I mentioned, the ability to download this particular or all the data sets that we have there. And in fact, here's the jitter plot that's left comparing non-coastal East Midlands with coastal East Midlands in terms of stroke prevalence, or no, sorry, I beg your pardon, hypertension prevalence, which I think is quite a dramatic contrast there. So it's really, the hope is that these are exploratory, and if you want to save the map as a PNG that you've just got here as a PNG file, you can do. I'll just go back just to illustrate it on the large scale map, just to see this kind of pattern that we're getting here. And although one has to be careful, because as I say, maps are slippery customers, you do get this sort of, you know, I think I see quite a distinctive coastal fringe effect.
Can you do mortality, like standardized mortality?
I thought I was giving this presentation standardized mortality. Standardized mortality, was it in this one? I'm not sure if I've got this up on there itself. No, I don't think, to be quite frank, I've got that data. That's some of the data that we've got and we've been using in the book, but it's not here on the CESA portal yet. As I say, this will all be there. What I haven't incidentally thought of was including the point data. Now, I'm afraid I've forgotten your name, who was talking about the locations of practices and of chemists and the like. And I hadn't thought of that, including that sort of data, or including tools to allow you to investigate it. Although there is, maybe it's in the connectivity services section. Okay, we've got this kind of stuff. So GP to the nearest, so LSOA drive time to the nearest GP. So I would expect to see quite a distinctive rural urban practice. So somehow or another, as we develop this, we've got to get a way of being able to see conveniently what we have. And well, you won't be surprised that actually accessibility to GPs is very good in the urban centres, and the more rural you get, and indeed in parts, you know, obviously there's a GP here and these ones are close, but you can start picking up these patterns. I'll come and have a look at that in more detail in a moment. So that's the Explore Data tab. I see we're already half an hour through. There's also what is possibly more useful, or useful in a different way, is the Explore Places tab. So actually, to do this, because I know place names in the southwest, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the southwest. I don't know my, in fact, just to make it fast, I'm also going to go to the Devon, Plymouth and Torbay area. So we'll just go to that. Again, the frustration of having to define the scope, define the coastal fringe, and then go to the Explore Places. So now what we can do is go to a particular place on the map, and I'm going to go to Teignmouth, locate it, that you might be interested in for whatever work you're doing on. Oh, sometimes you have to hold it still when you're clicking on it. There we go. Now, this is all the data that we've so far loaded into the CESA portal. So that is in part, and really this is just a lot of it is their placeholder data. So I've got some demography at the built up area 22 and demography from the built up area 21. I'm just trying to show that I can do this. But for the LSOA 21 data, quite a lot in there, the LSOA 11 data and output area, there's some in there as well. Okay, so this now allows you, should you so wish, to get all access to all the data we have for that area, which is a spot within the MSOA Plymouth South, and it's all those statistical areas, and it draws down whatever you might like. So we were talking about, what were we talking about? Let's have a look at community. What do we got? Communities Needs Index. We've got a few things there. So let's click on those, data extract, and it should come up with, now I've kept it to a small number because it's easier to just explain, but these are the variables you've selected for an LSOA. Actually, you know what, it will take a second or two long. Let's have a look at all the data. Data extract, all the data they've got. So this will take a moment, which will give me a chance to have another quick slurp of coffee. So this is trailing through all the data sets we've got, and should bring up onto this this panel here all the data that we have available, but all that's MSOA 21, that's LSOA 21, and so it goes, and so it goes. And in due course, I wouldn't want to click on this for all data when it's all there, but in due course there'll be over 1,000 bits of information about that particular location, taken from all sorts of geographies. Again, our hope, click on it, you download the extract. Not quite everything. There's some data that we've got, for instance, using Airbnb data, which we got sort of under contract, and some of the, I can't remember immediately which data sets there are, but we will have to put a sort of stop on downloading some of the data because they're commercially, you have to go somewhere else and pay for them, but we'll tell you where that is. But that allows you to download all that data about that place, which will give you the value, the rank in the country. So where did I collect? And so in terms of the IMD 2019, it's the 500, and there's information about how to interpret that, but it's the 5,394th most deprived place in the country. That spot, according to that particular measure, it's the second decile, and then in the scope of the area that I've set, which was Devon, Torbay and Plymouth, it was in the worst. You can explore this to your heart's content. It's because that's a geography, a 2011 geography, it can't do the coastal. Coastal wasn't defined in those terms, but when you get to 2021 geographies, it does say where you are in terms of where does that rank as a coastal area. So again, hopefully lots of data. We've collected all this. We want you to be able to use it as you wish, to meet your own particular needs. And I'm going to now just close, not to have all the data, but I'll just go to that community needs index one again, because you can also illustrate it as a plot just to see where you are. So in terms of, so where are we? We're Plymouth South. In terms of this community needs index, it's got it's, again, I'm trying to use this lower need or challenge or value and greater need. In terms of the connectedness score, it's very challenging, presumably because it's out on a limb, and in terms of the active engaged community scores, the details of which you would find on the Explore Data tab, it's much better off. Let's just go to something else whilst we're there. Look at, what was it, health you were looking at? Where's health got to? Health, morbidity, get rid of that one. Health, morbidity. QoF data, let's have a look at the set of QoF data as the plot to see how it's going in that particular location. So actually, in terms of these QoF scores, this part of the country's, this Plymouth South, relative to the rest of places in the Devon, Torbay and Plymouth, is actually not bad at all. But as I say, that could be because the population is healthy, or because the local GP doesn't pick up the data. But that's for you to explore with the data you can download. You can do it also in terms of putting in a postcode. So that's the Plymouth postcode. You can find by postcode. Hopefully that will come up in Plymouth, or you can use place names and find data in that way. So you get the explore data, explore places, and then there's the bit that I'm most excited to get on with, because I haven't done anything on this portal since I got since I did the learning process, really. This is all from scratch. And these are the discovery tools. And this is really where I'd love to get your feedback as to what you might find useful. I know, coming back to this after 9 months, I see all sorts of things that are frustrating, and I will change how we go through this process. But the discovery tools is the opportunity, I think, to provide sets of tools that people might find useful. And I've already, just doing this, I was thinking, well, actually, sometimes you might want to join a set of data together, have a look at you know, put a circle around an area, say, what's the characteristics? There's all sorts of things one can do. Things I thought about 9 months ago when I was thinking about this were weighted indexes, for instance. The weighted index was inspired by the Jarman. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember the Jarman index, which was used in an early deprivation index, but in fact it was originated as a GP workload. And what he did, he went away and he sent out a questionnaire to all the GPs in the country, or whatever the sample was, got back their professional knowledge about what was putting demands on their time. He then used his statistical skills and data and the availability of data, and use the professional knowledge, the statistics and the data to create an index. And in a way, what you can do with all these sorts of data, you have got the professional knowledge, you've got the professional interests in sexual health and pharmacies, and you can say, right, okay, what data do I want to bring together? Let's put a weighted index of these various things to say, these are areas that are short in pharmacies given the local level of need, or whatever it might be. And I can't even start to imagine what those research questions can be. But I can start to think, okay, let's see how we could implement tools that people can use. And this is where we get beyond what I think Tableau and these other standard out-of-the-box interfaces, data portals can provide. So that's the dream anyway. Or nearest neighbours. So one of the one of the challenge things about working with coastal areas is that lots of areas around the country share very similar circumstances or challenges, yet there's no administrative or political link between the two. Wouldn't it be great to put in, well, okay, this is my place. Where elsewhere is like me, like here, and can I contact them to see what they're doing, how they're approaching this? So maybe they're so that's not nearest neighbours in a sort of spatial sense, that's a nearest neighbours places like mine. The classifier I actually don't like anymore. And then the last one that I'll look at here, just to illustrate the sorts of things you might be thinking of. This is the only one I've done or try to implement. And what was I thinking? I think, okay, let's have a look at house prices. Where's house prices? House prices, affordability index there. That's one of my plots. And then the other one will be, you were talking about jobs, weren't you? Were you talking about jobs, accessibility to jobs? That was one of the things. That will be under economy, job opportunities, job access score. Right, so we're looking at job access score against housing affordability. Let's do a plot. Now the blues, now this is within scope of our area here. So this is Plymouth, Torbay and Devon. And the blues are within the coastal areas, we've defined it earlier on, and the greens are in the non-coastal or the inland areas. And what you can start saying, okay, where are the outliers here? Where are the places that, so this here, this is not a lot of job, or relatively sort of quarter of the way down, say, click on there, where are we dealing with? I'm glad that works. So that's on the outskirts of Plymouth. It's okay, but not great for work, but housing costs are low. Where are housing costs high? Now that's job access, where housing costs are this way. So let's, we've got to be slightly careful because there's a number, I'll break it if I don't get this right. Let's double click in there. Let's look at this place. So this is somewhere with few jobs and high housing costs, and we're looking at Ilfracombe. Okay, so just to explore, just to have a look, and this is just illustrative of what you might do, now if I click that, that should go back. It kind of illustrates the coastal problem to a certain extent, but it also allows you to explore the particularities. So it gets away from this sort of general coastal versus non-coastal, which I'm very worried about because coastal areas differ so much, and allows you to get to the nitty-gritty. And I've spoken for 40 minutes when I promised I'd speak for just 20. So that's probably all I should say about it at the moment, except for to say we're now in the stage when the data collection is coming towards an end, and it's time for me to come back to this and see if I can make something good and usable out of it. So to repeat, if you can throw any ideas my way, I'd be delighted. How does that do, Elaine? You all right?
That's great. Thanks, Alex. I think what's been evident this afternoon is the enthusiasm and interest from all of our three speakers, and we really do appreciate that. I think it's left me with more sort of thoughts and questions. I feel like I need to go away and look at the slides again and the CESA portal and just see. It looks like it'd be fantastic to play with. And I know that you're probably quite keen, if there's people out there who might be interested in looking at the resources, actually being in contact with you, Alex.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be great. So great. Are there any last burning questions? Because I'm just conscious it's about 20 to 4. Not for the minute, I don't think so. So as I said, we will be making sure that we send out all the presentations so that people can look at those, and we'll send those out in the next couple of days. If there's anybody who's particularly interested in collaborating or want access to the portal, please do let us know. We'll make sure that gets to the right individual so that we can connect people up. That was one of our sort of additional objectives for this afternoon, to look at some opportunities for collaboration. Can I just ask Sheela and Sheena, I mean, it was great that we looked at children and young people, and I can understand exactly why you did that. Might there be an opportunity to perhaps look at other groups of people, do you think?
Yeah, we've got some. So we've got, in terms of the sort of deep dive health chapters we did, we did one on older people, but data was a real problem on that. So quite a lot of those chapters were more looking at existing literature.
That's fine.
And then we've got a big chapter on health outcomes, but also we've got chapters on sort of public policy, so resource allocation, what the resources are, the way in which the resource allocation system works for that. So we can, and Sheela, you've got stuff on sort of cultural dislocation and regeneration. I'm just trying to wonder, I mean, we could probably do something on older people.
I was just thinking there might be some people who are interested in that particular policy area that might really appreciate that, but we can come back to you if that's all right with you.
Yeah.
Great. So
I mean, as we get more data, it'll be easier to do. Julian's or something. Hang on.
All right.
Do we want to? Do you want to unmute people? What did Julian say?
Just asking about. Alex was asking about ideas for his discovery tab, and I was thinking sometimes it's quite useful to have a bar chart with a sort of a line as well, two axes. So you have a sort of secondary data set linked. So rather than representing that as a scatter plot, you have a sort of bar chart maybe with a line with a rate by it as well. So it gives you a sense of the rate against the actual numbers. For example, might be one case. And then the other thing I was thinking about might be nice to have, like with the correlation coefficient possibly, or some basic stats if that's available. And then I also wondered if you could download the data from that section as well.
I'm not sure if I can from that section, but yes, I mean it's. I mean, if it makes it convenient, that's easily done. Add these buttons. I mean, as I say, it's the joy and the frustration of our shiny. You can do what you like, but it's actually can be difficult, time-consuming to do what you like.
It looks brilliant. That's what I'm going to say. It looks fantastic. So I am going to have a delve into that.
Yeah, that was great.
I think the plan is that there's quite a lot of data to upload onto it still, but we're getting there with regard to the data collection. And then Alex's task is to really work on that CESA portal and make it really usable.
And it is currently available. So that address is not a private address; that is a public address. So if anybody wants to explore it and to see how it works in practice, just go on it.
That's
And Alex,
great.
I was thinking, I mean, I don't want to offer your time out, but as part of the classification project, we'll be having workshops to really talk about the classification and how to use it. And it may be a case of also offering workshops on the CESA portal and how to use it for people.
If there's a demand down the line, but it should. I mean, I'd be disappointed if it isn't fairly self-explanatory, I have to say.
And you've got all your lovely videos there as well.
I've got all those awful videos there.
That's great. Well, so thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining us and listening. That's been lovely to have you join us. And thank you very much to Sheela, to Sheena and Alex for taking us through that really interesting information this afternoon. That's been so helpful and it's much appreciated. So if it's all right with everybody, we'll call this to a close. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.